So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Learning Science session. We are talking about creating and using effective rubrics, and we're very pleased to have joining us today Professor John C. Britton and Professor Philip Lee from the David A. Clarke School of Law. So let's just go over some of the tools with Zoom, and our goal for our webinar today. First, it's really how to create effective rubrics and learn from real use cases. So talking with Professor Lee and Professor Britton, we know that they use rubrics very effectively with their courses at the law school. So if you are not familiar with Zoom, let's just go over the toolbar very briefly. So you'll see that unmute icon as well as start video icon on your toolbar in the lower left corner. Feel free if you do have any questions at relevant periods, go ahead and unmute. You can also put that in the chat box. And if you'd like to be on camera, you can feel free to turn your camera on as well. Always nice to see everyone here. The chat box, just click on that chat icon. And reactions, if you can give us a thumbs up or some love, we love to see that. So once you click on reactions, you can go ahead and click on one of those emojis. If you'd like to change the skin tone, click on those three dots in the lower right corner, and you'll see at the lower right, there's a thumbs up icon. Click on that, you're able to change your skin tone. Feel free to go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you're able to do that. Thumbs up or a heart, always good to see. Thank you so much, Julian. Drew, Philip Lee, you got it, John. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. So our agenda for today, first, Julian will go over an overview of providing feedback, especially with rubrics, and then we'll segue into our faculty discussion and best use cases. We'll also have some time for Q&A and going over next steps. So with that, Julian.
Thank you, David. So I'll be speaking about providing feedback, whether it's with rubrics or any type of assessments that you're giving, and just some things you want to focus on or key in on as you're providing this specific feedback. Three main parts of feedback that should be considered at all times. We're talking about your focus, your level, and the function of the feedback. And we'll kind of talk about what each one has to do and how it's integrated into the feedback you're providing your students. Next slide, please, David. So focus, and some of you may have seen this before, goes back to Hattie, 2007, his kind of study on, best practices for feedback. But when you're talking about your focus for your feedback, it refers to your three major questions in evaluating. Where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? So you're talking about feedback having three different ways you can take your feedback and provide it to students. Your feedback can truly be feedback. How are they doing? Or how are they going with this specific assignment, assessment topic? Where am I going? Your feed up. So kind of leading them to where are you going? What's the goal of this? Where is your endpoint? And then you're talking about your feeding forward, meaning that what's the next step? What my feedback will be, where is this assignment leading me? What is my next steps to reaching that mastery of our specific assessment and our assignment? So then we talk about level. And your level refers to the level in which the feedback is directed. You have four. You have your task performance, providing specific feedback on correctness of a task. You have your process of understanding, which kind of leads back into your deeper understanding, your deeper learning, more focused on your deeper learning than the actual task of what they're doing. Your metacognitive and or your self-regulation kind of addresses the way students monitor or regulate actions towards that goal, especially when you're talking about group projects and different functions of that, being able to speak to that those direct actions that correlate towards the accomplishment or success of that specific assessment. And then your self-feedback. I know a lot of us use self-reflection and self-feedback in different aspects. But sometimes, they say self-feedback can kind of have a negative impact on goal attainment. And you may think, okay, well, how will the self-feedback kind of have that descriptor? But, when students aren't doing so well, we have the students that do well and they kind of self-feedback that, hey, I think I'm doing well, I think I got it. But you also have to understand, for those students who may not or maybe having challenges, that self-feedback can kind of come as a negative perspective, because I'm not doing well. I don't think I understand the project and or the course the way I should, or the way I would want to. So just things to kind of keep in mind when you're providing these different levels of feedback, or even asking students to do this kind of feedback for each other, to kind of think of where those positives and negatives can come in, and how we can best mitigate those so that all students feel successful throughout this process. And our last one is function. You know what the function of the feedback that you're giving is. The feedback I'm giving a question, meaning that I'm trying to get them to think a bit deeper into what they are doing. Is a suggestion. Hey, I suggest instead of doing this route, maybe you should go this route. That'll kind of help guide them towards where we're trying to go. Or is it just a blatant correction? Hey, this is inaccurate. Hey, this is probably where you need to go, so you can reach your destination for this. And these are just different types of feedback. Different functions of the feedback that you should be thinking about as you're providing it to students, to make sure that we're giving them the best feedback appropriate, whether it's rubric, whether it's assessment, whether you're doing your rubric feedback as well as in-text comments and feedback. I think that, you know, these are components that you really should kind of thoroughly think of what is my goal for my feedback. Overall, what am I trying to do with my feedback? Am I trying to engage deeper learning? Am I trying to just correct them, or am I trying to help guide them to a certain destination that I see them getting to, or a certain goal? And I think with that, I'm gonna move back to David, but thank you for having me. Lastly, I'm sorry. So thank you, David. So once again, I'm Julian King. If you do not know, I don't think I introduced myself, but I am Julian King, the Learning Design Coordinator here at Cal. I'm also our gradebook whiz. So if you're interested in using rubrics and incorporating them into your Blackboard, incorporating them into your assessment, please reach out. We have some great ideas for how rubrics are going to go. Thank you, Dr. Britton. We have some great ideas for how to implement rubrics for specific assessments and assignments and learning goals and outcomes. And we're also working on kind of new ways to spice those rubrics up to make sure that students are getting the most out of them. So if you have any questions about that, please email me.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. And are there any questions that we can answer so far about providing feedback? You can feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. Okay, so if you do have any questions, feel free to ask us. Thank you so much, Julian, for that.
Thank you.
Before we lead into our faculty discussion, I would love if Professor Britton and Professor Lee could introduce yourselves. Professor Britton?
Hello, I'm Professor John Britton at the law school. I've been involved in the law as a licensed lawyer for 53 years. I was a law professor at the University of Connecticut for 22 years. I was the dean of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law in Houston, Texas. And I've been here at the UDC for nearly 15 years. I was also chief counsel and senior deputy director for the National Lawyers Committee, a major civil rights legal organization where I managed over 25 lawyers, and I had over 12.5 large law firms as pro bono. And I engaged in litigation from the trial level all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Britton. Professor Lee?
Good afternoon to my wonderful UDC colleagues. My name is Phil Lee. I have been teaching law for the past 10 years. I am honored and humbled to be co-speaking with my wonderful mentor, Professor John Britton. I teach property, education law, and race in the law. I have a doctorate in education. I am focused on pedagogy and how to improve my teaching and trying to understand the learning process a little bit better. And I'm excited to engage in this conversation and dialogue with you.
Thank you so much. And we are very honored to have you both here with your expertise and your lens. So let's start a discussion before you showcase your examples. And I wanted to start with Professor Britton. Why do you use rubrics in your courses?
I learned the rubrics, like I learned a lot about teaching online back in 2020 when schools were shut down and we went to remote teaching. I had been familiar with rubrics before, but they weren't as easy to share with students until we started teaching on Blackboard. I mainly use rubrics, as you pointed out, in those 4 different ways, Julian, for exams and for feedback. I also use rubrics for written assignments by the students. I like the kind of scientific analysis of rubrics, whereas you will see I set up the rubric with various areas of feedback. And I have many MINI sections within those parts. And that is a kind of self-learning example in itself to see whether they will be assessed on this or that, and what might be better practices or what might be better answers. And this, to me, is a convenience for the professor, as well as it is a learning good and convenient tool for the students.
Thank you very much. And Professor Lee, the same question.
So I use rubrics for three main reasons. The first is to create clear expectations between the professor and his or her students in terms of what they should be learning, how they should be expressing their learning on their assessments. Secondly, I believe it produces uniformity in grading. The way I create my rubrics, I actually put point breakdowns by each section. So I think that allows for consistency as I assess the exams. And thirdly, part of what I do, a big part of what I do is I prepare students for the bar exam in part through my pedagogy. And I'll get to this with your second question. But I believe the way I grade and assess and share information with my students is in furtherance of that goal.
Yeah, and we could lead to the second question. So Professor Lee, what are some getting started tips with using rubrics that you can share?
Sure. I think one of the big points that teachers should think about is what their learning objectives are. And after you have those in mind, is there a way you can construct the rubric that furthers those learning objective? I'll just give you one example, and then as I go through my case study, I'll show you how I implement this. So on the bar exam, it's common for students to encounter essay questions called issue spotters. And there are these long fact-based scenarios. And the proper way to answer these questions to maximize your points is a certain form called IRAC. It stands for issue, rule, application, and conclusion. And so as you see my sample rubric that I will present in a few minutes, all of my rubrics are structured just like that. The grading boxes, the information, the concepts that I expect my students to know, it's structured IRAC. So if you're just getting started with rubrics, I think it's very important to reflect on your learning objectives and try to tie your assessment mechanisms and your rubrics to those objectives.
Excellent. Can you go over that acronym one more time for IRAC?
Sure. Issue, rule, application, and conclusion. And when I get to my rubric, I will explain what those things mean.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Lee. And Professor Britton, same question. What are some getting started tips you can share with using rubrics?
I think one of the major goals of a rubric is that it eliminates some of the vagueness of a student. For an example, that has a writing assignment, and it could be measured by poor, fair, very good, excellent. And that is all they receive. Or in other, particularly writing assignments, the professor may write a few paragraphs, at least a number of sentences, on that analysis. The rubric, to me, eliminates some of that vague way of measuring the student and commenting on the student's work by setting up the rubric, as you shall see, at least in abbreviated form, for this presentation. As my colleague, Professor Lee, said, though, it also is telling the students how the grader is thinking and what were the marks that the grader set in order to examine the student's work. So I think it helps students not only learn by the feedback, but they're learning essentially how is the professor thinking and what kinds of factors is the professor using for an evaluation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was very well said. So Professor Britton, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and then you can share your screen. Excellent.
This is a short rubric lesson. It's short in the sense that, let me go back one step and set it off right. Somehow this bar is hanging in my way, but I got it out of the way.
That
So,
happens. Mhm.
set up to show the slides, and I come over here and play from the start, but another thing comes up.
So if you just want to show the slides, if you go back to that setup slideshow.
There we go. I
Yep.
got it.
For us, we're seeing your view.
Yes, and you're seeing it now?
Yeah, but we see your notes. If you go back to the first
Yes,
page.
that's what,
Actually,
yeah,
there's a button on the top left that says swap displays.
okay.
I think
Yep,
that might,
Yeah,
yeah,
Yep,
change it.
I'm seeing I'm on
Yep, right there.
foreign device.
there
That's
you
better.
go. Perfect.
All right.
Thank you so much.
So here I am from UDC Law School. My signature, just for you to glance at with full transparency. And I come over, and I'm not out to teach you law. I'm just out to show you how you use the rubric. And so this, as my colleague, Professor Lee said, is an examination question. And the goal is to learn the subject, which is going to be torts, or the law of accidents. And in addition, as we do at UDC, we help prepare the students to take a bar examination. All law school graduates who want to practice law must take an examination in their state. And they also must show what they are going to do. You're the only participant in this meeting. You don't have that on your screen, do you?
No. We just see the slides.
Yes, all right, thank you. But something stuck a countdown screen up there for me. But in any event, what we try and do is help the students, and you'll see it in my sketch. So here goes a problem right here in which you can see a few highlights. And while you're scanning it, I will speak slowly. But this is a typical torts problem. And you're going to see two types of torts. One is called negligence. That's the law of a breach of a duty of reasonable care. And one is called strict liability. That's for something that's very direct and likely to cause harm. And this involves a crop duster, if any of you from that part of the country, which zooms down with liquid in the vehicle to spray over the plants to protect them from insects and other problems. And the pilot did not pull the plane up high enough after being only 10 feet from the ground, spraying this liquid, as you see here, for fertilizer, and crashed and caused injury. So torts is the law of recovery for injuries. I might add on the side as a little tort that most of you may have heard that a person who went on television and greatly criticized mothers, parents, friends of children who were shot in one of those awful killings at a school. And a person went on television and made fun of all that and said it basically didn't take place, and created this whole bit of danger to even many of the family. So they brought a suit against this radio broadcaster and television broadcaster. And just the other day, they won nearly $1 billion worth of damages. That is a tort. That's a tort for wrongdoing. And the purpose of torts is to recover money. Money is the only major remedy for a tort. So you see that here, that the people who are injured are suing this pilot. And the question is how? So here comes what you call the call of the question, when students take multiple choice examination, both in school and they take it later on in the bar. And this is how Professor Lee and I help prepare them, but it's going to have a little combination of a little essay question for it. Other essays are pure essay questions and they're much longer. So there are choices, generally 4 choices. And I picked the choice at the end, but you can see there between A and B, and C and D is the tort called negligence that I explained in the tort called strict liability. And here you see the answer in advance, and it's going to mean a point for the students that this deals with strict liability, and we'll go over the reason why in a moment. So here comes a short rubric, mainly for the explanation. But at the top, you have a criteria, and you see the 4 categories, and you see the number of points, all given to the students with pure transparency. But here's where you see IRAC. And Professor Lee used the terms for analysis different than I use, but I use issue, rule, analysis, not application, same thing, and conclusion. But in short here, you see that this is a standard learning tool for law students. It is voluntary. There are other types of them, but quite frankly, it shows you how to think like a lawyer. And so the first thing when someone says, well, a person crashed into my car and ran over me, how much can I collect for that? And a lawyer would say, and thinking like a lawyer, well, what is the issue in the case? And in this case, it's going to be, is it a negligent action, which is a little bit harder to prove, or a strict liability action, which is easier to prove? And so the issue is whether this plane is ultra hazardous activity. As you can see next, it's going to be a rule of flying a crop duster. And so if they spot that issue in various ways, they get a point. And then the second one is a rule. Now it's going to be a legal law rule called strict liability, which is a much more direct standard. As I said, it's much easier to prove, but it's also not as common as a negligence action. And here the question is the risk of harm could not be eliminated by the utmost care. Now that's a rule that says if you could have reduced the level of danger and risk, then it could be negligence. But strict liability is for those torts in which there's no kind of way to really reduce the danger and cannot eliminate the utmost care. So therefore, it's not negligence. And here I combine both the analysis and the conclusion, and it deals with crop dusting is a conclusion, is an ultra hazardous activity, going from the question presented, looking at the rule, applying it in this case, and what happened, they couldn't pull up and things like that, the pilot, and you get a conclusion that it's a cause of action for strict liability. Now, this analysis and this question for the students is not dealing with the ultimate point of who wins and who loses, who's liable, who can collect money or can't collect money. But it starts at the beginning of what type of suit from the analysis of these legal principles in torts should be applied. And they get the total number of points. Now, I consolidated that here, but in other rubrics, it's much larger, has many more points on it, and looks at materials that students have studied in class. So students go from studying cases with all the facts, all the reasoning, and then they go to a problem which doesn't have any judge's opinion, doesn't have any other information, has a set of facts and a set of answers. I'm not going to go through too much of this second one, but it is about a driver in a car, which I highlight for you. Part of this, by the way, is the ability of students to read a plain problem where, unlike undergraduate education, in which you often have the editor pointing out what is in the case and what is in the subject, here when it comes to examination, it's a raw set of facts, but it has key parts of it, as you see highlights, where facts are, you have this car called flimsy, and you have a driver, and you have airbags, and you're going to have later here, when you see down here, that airbags equipped and always requires a seatbelt. And the basic question is whether they had airbags for a head-on collision as well as airbags for a side collision. And that's what the injured party is going to say that was wrongdoing by the manufacturer for not having a side. So you see the car driven was hit in the second paragraph on the driver's side by a vehicle, which was going 45 miles an hour speeding over the speed limit. And you also hear the airbags did not open because it was designed, so we're dealing with what is called the tort of manufacturing and the tort of design called strict liability of torts. And but on these bolts you see down at the bottom anchoring the seat, they were broken, and she was thrown to the driver's side of the car and she was injured. So that's just a little quick story, see what's going on, and see the call of the question here as well as equipping this flimsy, you have to sometimes put a little smile in these made up problems, but it's no less real and true facts, with a side current airbag in the door to protect against such impact was missing here, and would approach what is called a design defect litigation. Here you see the problems again, and you see the driver would have the burden, the driver would simply have to prove, the driver would have the burden, and the driver would have the burden. So what burden is going to be? Burden means one side, mostly the plaintiffs, have to prove their case. And I point out just to see here that a reasonable alternative design would have reduced or avoided this injury, and the failure to adopt that alternative made the product not reasonably safe, and therefore they can bring what is known as a design defect case. And just run over quickly, and I'll end in 2 minutes. And here you have the IRAC again, and here you have that issue, risk utility test. The product is not reasonably safe. Whether, question or not, the boat was defective when sold is going to be a fact question to be decided. We're only trying to determine what the cause of action. It's for a jury, it's for a case or a court to determine the end result. That's not the point here. And the rule is alternative design. It's a major section called 402, in which if there was a possible alternative design, then that would set it up for the plaintiff to use this form of tort action of a strict liability in products for defective design. You see the analysis here, the product is defective, plaintiffs had a burden of proof, and lastly, conclusion, a product defective is a defense for strict liability in terms of whether the plaintiff who has the burden can show that this bolt and this design and no airbag that would expand when the car is engaged in a collision from the side is the issue. So that's how students are going to get this feedback from everything they've studied during the torts class. That's an example of using a feedback for an exam question, but I also use it for little mini test questions too, so they'll be ready for this in the final examination.
Thank you so much, Professor Britton. I do see a question from Dr. Carson in the chat box. It looks like you awarded 1 point for correct answer to multiple choice and 1 point for various elements of the IRAC analysis. But overall, you said your rubric generated 1 to 4 points, but what if you got none of the various points, multiple choice, none of the points related to IRAC analysis? Would that be 0 points?
Yes.
Okay. And then also, is it assumed that IRAC understanding builds from lower to higher levels?
Yes.
Perfect. Look at that. I love it. So thank you so much for Professor Britton and Professor Lee. If you could also share your screen. Was that working for you, Professor Lee?
Turn on your mic, Phil.
Oh yeah, you're also unmuted.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, it says that I have to set the permissions a certain way. So I'm just doing that now.
Yeah, no problem. And any other questions so far as we wait for Professor Lee that we can answer?
Let's try this. All right. Yeah, I apologize. I'm going to the screen, but I don't see
No problem.
it's not allowing me to do it. Could I send you the
Yes, you can do that.
Yeah,
Send me the PowerPoint.
delay. Yeah,
no worries.
I'm not sure why that did that. You could advance. Okay, so let me start here. As I mentioned before, I tried to structure my rubrics to capture the IRAC form: issue, rule, application, conclusion. David, next slide, please. So I'm a property professor, and the example I gave is related to property. actually can be applied to any law subject that I teach. We have many, many rules. And so what I wanted to do as part of this presentation is to show you how the rules I teach in class guide the rubrics I create in practice problems. So I have one illustration of a practice problem, but before I get there, let me start with, I just selected a random rule. This is called adverse possession. It's a property rule. It stands for the proposition that a trespasser who can acquire title to land, right, if certain requirements are made. So that's the general rule. I'm not here to teach law, but just keep that in mind. Someone who's not authorized to be on the land could eventually acquire legal ownership. Next slide, please. All right, so the elements or the rules of adverse possession, there's an acronym that I use in class. It's COHE. And so it goes continuous, open and notorious, hostile, actual, and exclusive. And these are the rule titles. Underneath each sub-element, there are rule explanations that talk about each part. And I'll quickly go through these. Again, I'm not teaching the law. If you were in my property class, I'd spend lots of time, about 3 classes, teaching you this framework. But I'll show you what my slides look like, and I'll show you what the students see. Next slide, please. So just take a glance at this. This is the first element of adverse possession, the C in COHE, right? And can we go to the next slide? We have open and notorious, the second element in COHE. And just take a glance at this. You don't have to memorize. You don't have to take notes. This is going to look very familiar toward the end of my presentation. Okay, next slide, please. We have the hostile element of adverse possession, right? And I talk about the majority rule. Next slide. There's actually 3 different possibilities for the hostility rule, the H under COHE. And this is a slide my students see, right? Next slide. The A, penultimate element of COHE, is actual. Here's the definition. Okay, next slide. And finally, we have exclusive possession, the final element of adverse possession. Here is the rule that I present in class. And so what I do is I understand on the bar exam, if they have an adverse possession question, my students have to know the rule, they have to internalize the rule, they have to memorize the rule. And so I came up with an essay exercise that incorporates the rules I gave them in class on these slides into their learning, into the expectations of what they're supposed to know. Next slide, please. So please don't even try to read this. The font is very small, but this is an actual essay practice, and it's very similar to what I would ask on my midterm or my final exam if I had an adverse possession question. Next slide. And here's the gist of the question. So we saw multiple paragraphs. Here's very simply what's going on. A landowner finds that her neighbor placed HVAC machinery on her land 10 years ago. The big question for this essay writing practice is, who now owns the land in which the machinery sits? And so if you understand the rule, you're going to connect these set of facts to adverse possession. And then my expectation is my students will then apply the adverse possession framework, COHE. Next slide. So here's the start of my rubric. I'll show you how it looks all together at the end. But you see my learning objective, my teaching objective. I'm trying to teach students to write in the IRAC form: issue, rule, application, conclusion. So this is the rubric for the exam you just saw. The first issue would be the first sub-element in adverse possession. Was possession continuous, right? The rule, if you see those words there, they're identical to my slide. They're identical to what I teach in class. So I'm expecting my students to internalize, to memorize the rule. And this is where in text form, in narrative form, they write the rule. The second or the third column is application. Others call it analysis. They're the same thing. This is where you apply the rule of continuous to the facts that I gave in the hypothetical. And finally, there's a conclusion. Therefore, the continuous element is satisfied. My essay was very straightforward. In particular, this element, the analysis, was very straightforward. Sometimes it's not. And so the conclusion could be the element is satisfied, or you could say it's not satisfied, as long as in the application section, the students can logically argue their side, then that's fine with me. They get full credit. if you also notice, I broke down the points for each column. I focused on rule and application. Property is a second year class. So if I was a first year professor in the first semester, I would actually allocate some type of points for issue and conclusion. But by the time they had an entire year of law school and they get to my class, almost no one is forgetting to write issue and conclusion, right? So this is discretionary choice. I chose just to put all the points in rule and application. Next slide. All right, I do the same thing with open and notorious. I just want to highlight some things. If you look at the second column, that is the rule. And again, it's identical to what I presented in class. It's the same as how I teach it. We have the analysis and the point breakdown. Next slide. I do the same thing with hostility, right? The rule, the application, and I'm assuming the issue and conclusion will be there because that's just how they've been trained from first year forward. Next slide. Actual, right? Same type of structure. And final slide is exclusive, the E and co-hay, right? And so we have issue, rule, application, conclusion. The point breakdown is right in the document. And so final slide. This is what it looks like. So what I pass out to my students, this is an in-class writing exercise. I give them 30 minutes to complete this exercise. On one side is the fact hypothetical, the question, and I tell them don't turn it around because the second side has this rubric. And so I give my students 30 minutes to write the answer. And if we have time, I give students maybe 10 to 15 minutes to pass the paper to their neighbor and they could try grading. So they go through the exercise in what the teacher does to see how time is spent on each section in terms of the assessment. And also it illustrates, sometimes there's gray areas where students almost say everything. I tell them it takes a lot of time for me to figure out how many points to allocate in those situations. So it's in your best interest just to write it clearly, to follow the rules I provided. I think the third benefit of the self-grading, the self-assessment, with your neighbor, is it shows you just how mechanical this process is most of the time. So if you have this cluster of words that are presented as the rule, you're going to get maximum credit. And that's the same for the bar exam. There are certain rules and there's certain concepts involved. They're articulated in very specific ways by judges. And the closer you get to that language, the more points you're going to get. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for turning the slides, David. Appreciate you.
Oh, it's no problem. I know that happens all the time whenever I want to show something. It just doesn't work that one time, right? So
Yeah.
it's no worries at all.
Okay.
Right. Professor Britton, go ahead.
Professor Lee, one of the chat questions asked about the Gutman rubric analysis, and I'm familiar with it. The Gutman analysis, in my view, is much more open-ended. And if you look at it even on Wikipedia, it has nearly half dozen open-ended questions about how you look at these issues. I just saw you in this last set of slides with your multi-function rubric in which you emphasize that the law looks at rules and the bar looks at rules. Do you think you could use the Gutman rubric in teaching law the way we're doing?
I think it'd be very difficult. I think it would be easier to use that type of rubric for papers. But in terms of the rule-based classes, the doctrinal-based classes that I teach, I think it would be difficult. I mean, I could probably think it through and figure out a way, but I just don't see a one-to-one relationship there.
Well, for the person who answered that question, you have received our reply.
Thank you very much. And I do want to put on the screen, we appreciate both Professor Lee, Professor Britton, your perspective on this. It just adds a lot of value to using rubrics, especially in your use cases. So I do want to open this up to the entire group today. What are some takeaways from our session today? And what are your perspectives now on using rubrics? And Professor Lee and Professor Britton, has your perspective changed, or is there anything that you learned from each other today?
If I could start, I've heard
Yeah.
students tell me that Professor Britton uses multiple choice and he combines IRAC with multiple choice. It was wonderful to see how that works. I couldn't think of how to combine those things, but I thought that was really neat and helpful. So I think going forward, I'll probably consider how to do that in my own assessments.
Excellent.
I like the way Professor Lee has a much what I call deep down use of rubrics. In one, there were nearly a half a dozen items rather than the well-known one called IRAC, which is just one form of studying. It's not the end result. And I too have a more expansive one, but I like the way Professor Lee puts in more items to bring out students' abilities.
Excellent. And before we conclude today, I do want to just put in the chat box some resources here. So if you see first, let me go ahead and copy that here. If you do have any general questions for us at the C.A.L team, you can email us at our C.A.L help desk at udc.edu email address. I also put Professor Britton and Professor Lee's emails there as well if you do want to follow up. If you would like to attend any of our future professional development options or sign up for C.A.L office hours, you can also do that on our C.A.L website. I put the link there. And we do upload our recorded webinars to our YouTube channel. We have over 60 now, which is great. So I will put this shortly on there as well. And our C.A.L website does include resources that you can use as well. Are there any questions I can answer? Professor Britton, go ahead.
I would like to add
that
the law school admissions office welcomes you showing any interest that you may want to go to law school. And we have a provision that with the approval of the professor, you may come and sit in a law school classroom during class just to listen and just to see how law school is taught. And that may help you decide whether you have any interest in going to law school. I always grant permission when the admissions office asks if a student can sit in on a class. I welcome you to come and see how law is taught.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, Professor Britton. Yes, and before we conclude, are there any final thoughts from Professor Britton or Professor Lee? But I do want to thank you. I know for Julian and I, this was a really great session, and just having your expertise and your lens, it's great. It really just adds that value. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I hope that you can get in contact with Professor Britton and Professor Lee. I also like that suggestion of sitting in on a class after speaking with admissions. That's great. So thank you everyone so much for coming here today. We hope you have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you in a future session. So have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.